Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. People of Reddit who have gone on multi-day hiking trips, such as the Appalachian Trail, what was your horror story from the trip? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Night 1 of a trip at Sleeping Giant in Canada, I believe. First night out, I'm always a little jumpy because it takes a while to get used to the sound of the woods, and this was no exception. It was a solo trip, so just me in a little tent on the edge of the forest, looking out onto a small slope down onto a pebble beach. I was having some real trouble getting to sleep. The woods were just so loud and my mind kept jumping to serial killer instead of normal wildlife. I was trying to convince myself otherwise when I hear some heavier footsteps, breaking twigs. My heart is in my throat because I just know I'm going to die all alone in the Canadian backwoods. Then I hear a crash and some falling rocks directly outside of my tent, and I work up the courage to turn on my flashlight and unzip the door to have a look, at which point I catch a glimpse of the very clumsy woodland elk that had just fallen down the slope onto the beach right in front of me. Didn't die. Great Dividing Range in Australia. Doing it in summer, so we didn't take tents, just slept in sleeping bags in the open under the stars. We had tent flies with us in case it rained. Gorgeous, except for the one night where we camped near a huge infestation of caterpillars, fuzzy, hairy ones. Spent the whole night half asleep and peeling tickly, fuzzy things off my face. I was on a canoe camping trip on a long, narrow lake. My wife and I had set up about halfway along the lake, and all was well. After dark, I went to wash my face in the lake, and I see two lights on the other side of the lake. It was only like 50 meters wide. As I'm watching, their headlamps fade and die, and then something big starting snorting over there. A moose or a bear. It was pretty loud. It was a still night, and so I called out to them, "Hey, are you alright?" It turns out they had accidentally started hiking from the wrong parking lot, delaying them an hour or two. And then when they got to the lake, they had hiked down the wrong side of the lake. So I offered, and then went and picked them up in a canoe and lent them a flashlight so they could set up. I think they were pretty relieved to have gotten away from whatever animal that was. If I hadn't been there, that would have been hours of hiking to get to the next campsite, without lamps. Not hiking, but kayaking. My father and I took a multi-day kayaking trip on Yellowstone Lake. He totally underestimated how far away the campsites were over water, and what we thought would be a 3-hour kayak trip was an 8-hour kayak trip. Got there and set up camp and enjoyed it, but we were supposed to leave to another site the next day. That didn't happen. A storm that wasn't on the forecast rolled in, and we ended up quite literally holding the tent from blowing away. We used every ounce of rope. Thankfully, Dad always packed extra to tie it down, and we still ended up holding the rods from inside the tent. The third day it let up a bit, and we realized we had to get the hell out. That was almost worse. We had to kayak back. About half through the weather went bad, and we were fighting against the wind and rain. Took 10 hours to get back, fighting against the white water on a damn lake. I was 15 and I was exhausted, cranky, and so sore I didn't move from the car the next day. LOL. Oh, and no cell phone reception. Day 3 of 5 was at a waterfall. There were a few large flat rocks, maybe 500 feet from the base of the falls, that were large enough to fit a tent. So that's what me and my tent mate did. It rained that evening. The rock we pitched on was raised from the surrounding river by a few feet when we set up camp, but the river quickly swelled once the rain started. To complicate things, the wind coming off the falls was pushing the falls facing wall of the tent in by about a foot or so, and rain was pouring horizontally through the space where the two zippers meet. At one point during the storm, I stepped out with the intent of moving our packs to higher ground, and while I was doing so, my tent mate decided to get a look at the situation as well. Well, as soon as he stepped out, the tent instantly caught a gust of wind and was swallowed by the river, sleeping bags and all. Lucky for us, there were a few solo guys in our group with extra room in their tents, but sleeping in a cramped 1.5 person tent with no sleeping bag or pads is not a fun experience in the least. The following morning, we were able to fish our tent and lost gear off the river rocks below. The tent was a complete loss, as both the rods were snapped in multiple sections, and our sleeping bags and gear were waterlogged. We had to hit the trail, though, in order to make it to our next destination by nightfall, so we had no choice but to pack everything up and hike with all the extra weight. Somehow, we made it to our destination shortly after lunch, and were blessed with a sunny, grassy clearing and an awesome dude in our party who thought to bring rope so we could string a clothesline and dry out our gear before the evening. I learned a few valuable lessons on that trip. 1. Don't camp in the middle of a river. 2. Lash your tent down. 3. Bring rope, because it's just handy to have. 4. The other people in your party might have to save your dumb ass one day, so be humble. 5. Get a camp towel. A full-size terry cloth beach towel is like 20 pounds when soaking wet, and I would have done anything to yeet that thing off the side of a cliff if I had been a littering asshole. I mean, as I was reading it, I was like, well, that probably wasn't the best spot to set up your tent, but, I've been wrong before, but, yeah, I mean, had you not gotten into the tent, or maybe if you slept a lot, I mean, you could have went over if the water rose high enough. That would have been real bad. Anyway, glad it all worked out and you learned some lessons. One day, fresh out of college with no friends in the area, I hiked a rough, unmarked herding trail in the mountains I was somewhat familiar with on a hot August day by myself. It followed along a beautiful stream lined with spruce trees and tall grass along the banks, very picturesque. It was a designated wilderness area with few official recreational trails nearby. However, because it was in the tall grass and I wore pants, worried about ticks, I got hot really fast. Sweating up a storm, I came to a nice bend in the river way out in no man's land. I stopped at this point and decided that river was looking extra inviting. So I stripped down to nothing and waded into the water. Wasn't worried about anyone stumbling upon me, as no one really knew about this trail. The water was ice cold and deeper than I thought, but totally worth it. After cooling down sufficiently, I decided to go see what was around that river bend. Wading through the water at chest depth, I was relatively silent. Got closer to the bend and peered around the corner slowly. Saw more spruce trees, a rock, then another small spruce tree, and next to that, a giant bull moose in the water, having a nice drink. I froze. He was less than 50 feet from me, and he didn't know I was there because I was so silent, trying my hardest not to make a sound while also panicking. I slowly but quickly turned around in the water and rushed back to shore, trying not to make a sound, except every time I exhaled, I said, "I don't want to die," under my breath for some reason. I think it was a slight panic attack, as I was alone deep in the woods, naked in the water with a bull moose. I got back to shore, gathered my clothes, and ran totally naked through the woods for quite a distance, before stopping to at least put shoes and underwear on. Continued running until I got out of the woods and back to my car and sat there until the shaking stopped and I could drive home. TLDR, I accidentally went skinny dipping with a bull moose in the middle of the wilderness. Went on a 12-day trip in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. On day 2, we passed the mom grizzly with her cubs at about 40 yards away. Got to our next camping spot just before dark. Heard crashing in the water nearby in the middle of the night. Turns out it was a moose, still spooky, but not as bad as grizzlies. Next day, found some bear sign around where we camped. On day 11, we were back to this spot as our final camping site for this trip. Saw grizzly tracks on top of our boot tracks. Easy to say we didn't sleep much that night, even though we were exhausted. Not a true horror story, but felt the fear being many miles deep, with no means of contacting any help. Not that anyone can help much if a grizzly is attacking and you're so far from civilization. It was supposed to be a 2-night stay in the backcountry in Grand Teton National Park with my parents. The day we hiked out, it rained the entire day and only got worse when we got to where we were camping. Everything was soaked through despite our best efforts. This was far from the first backpacking trip we'd been on, and we ended the day with sleet. I ended up wrapping myself in one of those emergency foil blankets inside my sleeping bag to get warm. We were so miserable the next morning that we threw in the towel and hiked back to civilization in perfect weather. Every single person we crossed paths with the next day were shocked we'd even bothered going out the day before. Moral of this story, If you compare your father to Ron Swanson on a regular basis, don't let him make decisions about activities if inclement weather is in the forecast. Hiked 50 miles of the Appalachian Trail with some friends after graduating high school. We did 12 miles a day for 4 days. Took us pretty much all day each day to get all 12 miles done, except for the last day. I woke up with the worst diarrhea of my life, shat my brains out thoroughly at sunrise. We hiked those last 12 miles before lunch. Also, 3 out of the 4 of us found deer ticks. We thought the 4th guy was quite lucky. Turns out he also had a deer tick, but he just didn't find it. Poor guy got Lyme disease. I was carrying too much weight. I slipped in some mud and pulled a groin muscle. My wife was freaking out and didn't know what to do, and the mosquitoes were insane, making decision-making difficult. So we ditched our packs under some trees, tried to figure out where on the trail we were, hobbled 4 miles back to the car, and tried to come up with a plan. It turned out there was a county road about 1/8 of a mile from where we ditched the packs. Probably could have just flagged someone down. Hiking in the Smoky Mountains. There were 5 of us, 17 to 18 years old. We rolled into Gatlinburg and stopped at a gas station. This old toothless guy, leaning up against the wall, so stereotypical he could have been a character actor, said, "I wouldn't head up there, there's a storm brewing." An 18-year-old me, like a complete dipshit, replied, "Oh, it's okay, we've got rain parkas." We mapped our hike, not quite realizing the first leg was up a freaking mountain, and parts of it were like climbing a ladder. Freezing rain started about 2 hours in. Then it turned to snow flurries. By the time we got to a campsite, we were seriously freezing. My hands were so cold and shaky I could not untie my hiking boots and wound up cutting off the laces. I couldn't open my pocket knife and wound up using a portable tree saw we had bought. It was freezing rain, then snow most of the night, and we sealed the tent up so much that frost formed on the inside from our breathing. In the morning there was 4 inches of snow on the ground, and I had left my boots by the fire, stupidly thinking they would somehow be dry or something. They were curled up frozen on the rocks. We understood we had and were experiencing hypothermia and decided to head back. The choice was 3 miles ahead or 5 miles back, so we decided to go forward. Even with the snow on the ground, the path was easy to follow. However, we had to cross an extra bridge and discovered the bridge was washed away. So we had 2 miles to go or 7 miles back. The bridge was washed away, and there were 3 to 4 inches of snow on the ground. We knew we'd have to wade across a swollen river with what turned out to be some fast-moving water. Picture in your mind 5 teenagers taking off their boots and pants, shoving the pants into the straps of our backpacks, and willingly wading through 4 feet of 33-degree water. Every one of us slipped on rocks and went in. The pain of the cold was indescribable, especially when the water hit my scrotum. This was my first lesson in having to endure something you have zero control over. Anyway, the last person across was my best friend, and it was his car we drove down here. Like the rest of us, he slipped and fell into the river, but when he stood back up, he realized the river had yanked his pants out of the strap of his backpack. In his pants pocket were the car keys, his wallet, and $200 to get us home. So 5 dumbass kids are now screaming in alarm as we run around in our bare feet and underwear, with 4 inches of snow on the ground, trying to follow the riverbank, hoping we see our friend's pants washed up somewhere. Of course, we never found the pants, and hobbled back down the mountain and hitched a ride with a local back into town. We were so miserable looking at that a hotel lady took pity on us and gave us a room with only that the promise that our parents would wire money and FedEx a spare set of keys. This was in the mid-'80s and before Gatlinburg became a tourist trap. At night during the freezing rain, we all heard loud cracks and stuff falling. We thought it was the wind was taking out branches of trees, and I seriously thought I might have fallen asleep and be crushed to death by a falling branch. But in the morning, looking at the trees, we realized that the driving rain had frozen to the trees, and that the wind bending at the trees has made that ice crack and fall. None of us had ever camped in the winter, and we were totally and naively unprepared. How none of us died of hypothermia, I don't know. God loves stupid kids, I guess. I did a week-long backpacking trip through northern high country of Yosemite National Park. It was awesome, except for that one day went through a place called Bear Valley. It was absolutely beautiful, with this creek running gently down through a meadow with flowers blooming all around. But when it was time to set up camp, I found why the place was called what it was. There were bear signs everywhere, big bear signs, massive bear shits and claw marks on trees almost 20 feet up. I kept walking around until past midnight. In the end, I did end 20 miles that day in order to get clear of the bears. Also, I ran out of food, never turned back since I was doing a loop, lost 20 pounds that trip, weighed about 220 before, weighed 197 after. When I was a kid, like 10ish, my parents took us on a family vacation, a week-long backpacking trip through the Smokies. It was mostly fine. I still look back on it fondly, but there were big millipedes everywhere, and you had to be careful when packing up, otherwise you'd probably roll one up in your tent or something. But worst was, I went into my sleeping bag for the night. I felt something crawling along my leg. It felt like an inchworm, but it was in fact a bee. Somehow, fortunately, I'm not allergic. But dealing with a bee sting in my calf right before a bed, some 10 to 15 miles from the trailhead, not fun.